Read, Right, and Wrong is brought to you by the team at City Limits Publishing. City Limits Publishing is a small, independent press created by authors for authors. You can best support the podcast by heading over to citylimitspublishing.com to browse our ever-expanding library featuring unique reading experiences in all genres. Sign up for the City Limits Publishing Book Club and get one new release of your choice delivered every month alongside a curated classic book. Learn all about this and more at citylimitspublishing.com. In the meantime, let's get right into today's episode. Hey there, everybody. What's going on? This is Read, Right, and Wrong, the in-house author chat show at City Limits Publishing, where we discuss everything we've read, what we're writing, and what's wrong with it all. I'm your host, Peter Fenton, and today we are talking all things historical fiction with author Scott Ferguson, who has 11 books releasing with us, and possibly a 12th one coming soon. We have 2 books releasing in the very near future. We have The Life and Times of Maggie O'Toole and Escape, both releasing this spring. Scott, welcome.
Thank you.
So my first question to ask my guests, tell us a little bit about yourself. I've read your bio, and it seems like you've lived a very interesting life. Lots of interesting career moves.
Yeah, I'm sure you don't have too many Secret Service people writing fiction that has nothing to do with the Secret Service. But I spent 40 years working for the Secret Service in various capacities. The last 35 years as a uniform division member, and I got to the rank of lieutenant before I retired exactly 40 years to the day when I started.
Wow.
Other than that, my dad was in commercial radio in the Midwest, so if you're into that, that means that anytime you want to get a pay raise or anything in small markets like that, you had to change radio stations. So we moved around quite a bit when I was a kid.
Yeah. Where about in the country did you live?
I was born in Minnesota, and I think we lived in like 4 different towns in Minnesota. And then we moved to Iowa. We moved to 3 different towns in Iowa. And then my dad got a job with the Voice of America here in Washington, D.C. In actually the end of 1969. So by 1970, we were living in Virginia, and I've been here ever since. Well,
Wow.
I'm in Maryland now, but I've been in the D.C. area since 1970.
Yeah, are you whereabouts? Whereabout is Bethesda from where you are?
Oh, Bethesda's on the other side of D.C. from me. If you look at a map of Maryland, and if you look down in the southeast corner, you'll see a peninsula that sticks out between the Potomac River, the Patuxent River, and is right there on the Chesapeake Bay. Go about as far as you can on there, and that's where I am.
Wow. I spent the first 7 years of my life in Bethesda. So.
Oh, did you?
Yeah. So when I saw, full disclosure for the listener at home, I'm calling you at a 301 number. So I was like, wait, I know that area code. It was funny. But I've been living in the greater Philly area ever since, basically. So.
Yeah, I'm not really big on cities, so I'm really glad to be retired out here in the country.
Yeah.
So I don't have to deal with the traffic and the noise and stupid things people do sometimes.
Certainly. Do you have any interesting stories that are not classified information from your Secret Service days?
Oh, my goodness. Peter, I'm going to tell you the truth about being a Secret Service Uniform Division member.
Yeah.
If you're on a regular assignment at the White House, you're bored to death because you're sitting in a booth or you're sitting on a post inside of a building somewhere, pretty much not doing much of anything but observing people walking by. If you're assigned to the Vice President's residence, it's the same thing. Mm-hmm. If you're assigned to our Foreign Missions branch, that's street patrol, and that can get interesting. But for the most part, it's really, really mundane.
Huh.
If you're on a protective detail, the odds are you're going through people's bags and you're interacting with the guests as they come in. But honestly, unless something goes wrong, it's probably one of the most boring jobs you could ever possibly have. That being said, I can tell you that a lot of the fun that you have is interacting with tourists when they come to the White House and such.
Oh, yeah? What
Yeah,
what does it
years and
look
years
like?
and years ago,
Yeah.
when Ronald Reagan was president, they were building a building on East Executive Avenue on the White House, just inside the White House grounds, and it was the old. I think they've replaced it, but it was the old visitor center. The first one we had for a magnetometer building, where guests would come in. They would drop their bags and stuff on a conveyor belt, which would go through an X-ray, and then they would all go through metal detectors.
Mm-hmm.
Well, while they were building it, they had this big green solid fence all the way around it. It's like, I guess it was like 20 feet tall or something like that. And tourists would always come by and ask you, what are they building back there? Or what is this big green building? And I never did it, but some of the guys I would be walking around the foot beats and stuff with would look at them and say that it's a Minuteman missile silo, because Reagan figured if he's going to put a nuclear missile silo in your yard, he should have one in his.
Well.
So, we got a big kick out of it, but of course the tourists didn't.
Right.
So,
No. Did you ever say stuff like, "Well, I'd tell you, but I'd have to kill you"?
of course, everybody uses that line.
Yeah.
That's the most fun, because half the time the people don't know if you're serious or not.
Right. Even when you laugh.
Yeah. So,
Yeah.
yeah, we love doing that one too.
So 40 years in the Secret Service, ready to spring into action.
Yeah, something like that.
Yeah. Well, it's a very interesting profile to have as an author, I would imagine, because you're always observing people. So I'm sure your ability to pick up on things about people has translated well into your writing.
I would hope so.
Yeah.
I don't use that much real people in my writing.
Mm-hmm.
Although, like anybody else, your experience and knowledge and relations with other people are going to influence what you write. But I don't purposely try to use anything from anybody, except maybe Maggie was my mother was kind of the role model for Maggie, simply because of her perseverance and ability to cope with things.
Yeah.
But other than her, I don't really think I've used anybody as an example.
Interesting. Well, we'll talk a little bit more about your characters and all that in a later segment, but why don't we transition into our first main segment of the podcast? So, we're going to talk about recent readings. So, Scott, you've written a number of different books, a lot of them being historical fiction. Is that the sort of thing you like to read? What are some of your favorite books?
Well, let's see. My all-time favorite book is Got to Be Gone with the Wind. To think that Margaret Mitchell wrote this 400 and some odd page book, and that's the only book she ever wrote, is just absolutely amazing. Gone with the Wind is obviously it's not a fantasy. It's an historic novel, but I mean, a lot of what they go over is obviously not the true Old South and all the rest of that stuff. But it is very interesting the way that they, even considering the changes in the way that society is now from then, the way that her characters relate to each other, especially what the former slaves dealing with their former masters and such. It always reminds me of the character Mammy. She was a wonderful character, and she's got to be the epitome of a nanny. Yeah, I know she was a black, and I know she was a slave, but she was basically a nanny for this woman her entire friggin' life. And you got to admit, that's pretty awesome.
Yeah.
So, and especially, I don't know that much about Margaret Mitchell. I just know that she wrote, probably, if you're going to write one book and be done, that's really the way to do it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, write that huge doorstopper, the fantastic story, and call it a day.
And then have it made into probably one of the, if not the best, well, it's not the best, I'm sure, but probably one of the top 10 movies of all times. It's just phenomenal.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I have never seen the movie.
Oh my God, you have to. Oh,
yeah.
My
I remember it was a big deal.
Oh.
I remember it was a huge deal when it came out because they said, "Frankly, my dear, I don't give a damn."
Oh yeah, they almost didn't put it out because of that.
Yeah, which is crazy.
Yeah. Well, if you've got a good, I know it's springtime now, so it probably won't happen. But next winter, when you have a nice, good snowstorm, sit down and watch that movie because it's really, really long.
Hmm.
But it's a phenomenal movie. I mean, the characters are great. I think Scarlett is Olivia de Havilland, if I remember correctly,
Okay.
and she just does a fantastic job all throughout that book. Or,
Yeah.
I mean, through the movie. I'm sorry. It's really. I mean, I know that in today's the way that the world is today, that talking about slaves and the Civil War and the interaction between the races back then. How should I put this without putting my foot in my mouth?
Yep.
Even
Choose
though
your words
it's
carefully.
obvious that the black people in the movie were former slaves, they aren't treated like trash. You know what I mean? They're not
Okay.
treated like they're beneath them. They're treated not exactly equals, but not like you would expect a slave to be treated.
Sure.
So, you know, it is what it is, and it's really an enjoyable story.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a time capsule of where filmmaking and storytelling.
That's exactly what it is. It's a time capsule of the way that people treated each other during and after the Civil War, because a lot of the story is after the Civil War.
Yeah. And also the filmmaking of the time, because like if that same movie were made today, there would certainly be a different way in which they went about having black characters and the story being told there.
Oh, absolutely.
So I think if you go in with that mindset, then I think that you can still appreciate that, knowing that this movie would not be made today.
No, it's like parts of the Wizard of Oz, especially the part with the Munchkins. You would never ever see anything like that made. I know they're remaking the Wizard of Oz, and it's going to be interesting to see
what they
do with the Munchkins, because if you look at the character of the costumes that those Munchkins wore in the original, I just don't see them doing something like that today.
Sure.
I really don't. I mean, flowers coming off of the toes of your shoes? That would be interesting.
Yeah. I didn't know that they were making a new Wizard of Oz movie.
Yeah, I think I saw something about that a month or so ago, where they're talking about remaking the Wizard of Oz. And that's one of those movies that it's like Casablanca. You never remake Casablanca. You never remake The Maltese Falcon or some of these other movies.
Yeah.
You just can't remake them. It's like comparing the original True Grit with the remake.
Yeah.
The remakes just never seem to quite measure up, you know?
Mm-hmm. It's the story was written and told in a very different time and place, and that doesn't necessarily translate to the 21st century.
Oh, absolutely not.
Yeah. But these stories that we have from the past, we can appreciate for what they were in the time that they were made. You know?
Well, that's what really is frustrating for me, and I know a lot of other people. When society looks at famous characters and famous eras, and they judge those people not by the standards to which they were living, but by today's standards, and of course they're going to come up short.
Right.
And I just don't understand why you would possibly do that. It just doesn't make any sense to me.
Yeah, I get that.
Know?
Yeah.
I mean, I can't imagine living, for instance, living during the Civil War and not being able to look up to like Abraham Lincoln or Ulysses Grant or even Robert E. Lee if you're from the South. And then sit there 150 years later and say, well, this person was terrible because they did this, that, or the other thing, which was the norm in their time period.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, and who knows what we're doing now that 50, 100 years from now, people will look back on us and say, huh, that was so wrong.
Exactly.
Because, I mean, I think of myself as a guy just doing my best, and I'm sure you do the same. But yeah, no, it is interesting. So Gone with the Wind is an all-time favorite book for you.
Absolutely.
What are you reading right now?
Right now, I'm reading a book. I found a book on my youngest son's bookshelf in his room.
Mm-hmm.
He's 30 years old, so he's gone. He's married. He lives in New York now, New
Sure.
York State. But I was up in his room doing something. I don't remember what. And I looked on his bookshelf, and I saw a book called The Lees of Virginia, which is the history of the Lee family from when they came here in the 1670s all the way up through Robert E. Lee.
Okay.
And so when I read all of that, I'm like, hey, this is really cool because I like, historical nonfiction.
Mm-hmm.
And so I went to the library and I got a book called What They Didn't Teach You About the Civil War. And I'm kind of reading that right now.
Okay.
So right now I'm kind of into nonfiction.
Yeah.
Just before that, I read, what was it called? Pirate's Latitude by Michael Crichton. That was the last book he wrote. In fact, he was already dead. They found it in his desk at home, already completed. So that was an interesting book too.
I wonder about the ethics of releasing a book after someone's died.
That's kind of. I mean, I guess the family would profit from it, and that's a good thing.
Yeah. Oh, definitely.
But I mean, how would you do any edits on that? You can't ask the author.
Yeah.
If this would work or that. You pretty much just have to go with what they wrote.
Mm-hmm.
But I guess with somebody like Michael Crichton, you're not going to do a whole lot of editing.
Yeah, I guess not. And I mean, sure, the widow or the family could sign off on the deal for the book. But if the family is not a family of writers, it's hard to go to anyone and say, hey, we propose XYZ changes. What do you think of this? And it's like, well, I don't know. I'm not them. I mean, my dad is an author as well. And I mean, if someone went to me as a writer and said, hey, we want to change these things about your dad's book, I don't really know if I would be able to say, I guess,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, I understand. I agree completely.
So what about this? What they didn't teach you about the Civil War?
Well, this book was written, I think it was in the late 90s. I'm not sure if it's 1996 or 1998.
Okay.
But the guy goes through, he goes through, like, the epic battle of the ironclads. And he talks about how the South took the Merrimack and rebuilt it and rechristened it the CSS Virginia.
Mm-hmm.
And the big battle with them. He talks about the excuse me, the submarines that were used during the time. He talks about prostitution. He talks about the evidently in 1937 or something like that, somebody went around, and I'd have to go back and look at the book to verify who it was, but somebody went around and interviewed a bunch of former slaves and asked them about their lives as slaves and their masters and all the rest of this stuff. So he delves into that a little bit. It's pretty much like chapters cover different topics, but doesn't get real deep into them.
Okay.
One chapter I just recently finished was about medical malpractice, he called it, during the Civil War. And he talks about how most of the people who died during the Civil War didn't die from injuries sustained on the battlefield. They died from disease. Mm-hmm. And he talks about the horrible way when the doctors were treating you, they never washed their hands, they never washed their I know utensils is not the right word, but their equipment.
Equipment.
Any of that stuff. They didn't. Either they didn't know, or they were just whatever. And so most people died from infection or from smallpox or various other diseases that were going around.
Interesting.
So, that stuff was kind of interesting, I thought.
Yeah, no, I think that it's an interesting. It feels like they're picking up on topics that just don't really get talked about as much.
Yeah.
The slice of life sort of
he
things.
He doesn't talk a whole lot about, the Battle of Shiloh or Gettysburg
Mm-hmm.
or, any of the other major battles of the sacking of Atlanta, such stuff like that. He doesn't really talk that much about that. He does talk about when Richmond fell because there's a lot of stuff that was going on in Richmond, and it was the capital of the Confederacy. So, but the specific battles he just doesn't really go into. And it makes it even more interesting because he looks at the little things.
Yeah. Oh, that does sound like an interesting book. I might have to pick it up.
It's well worth it, I gotta tell you.
Yeah.
With this COVID stuff and everything, I'm a slow reader, which sounds funny for somebody who writes, but
yeah.
I'm a slow reader, so I don't usually finish the book in the allotted time that the library gives you. So I wrote down what page and chapter and stuff I was on, and then after I took the book back, because they wouldn't renew it, after I took the book back, I had to wait, I think it was 2 weeks to get it back so I could read it again.
Yeah.
But, it really is worth going to the library and picking it up.
Well, cool. Yeah. I definitely. So why don't we transition into our next segment? So we've talked about what you've read or what you're reading, and why don't we talk about what you've written? In our next segment, Writing Away. So you have 2 books that are coming out very soon from the recording of this podcast. We have The Life of Maggie O'Toole, The Life and Times of Maggie O'Toole, and Escape. So tell us a little bit about both of those books.
Maggie starts off as a 15-year-old girl who lives in a major city. Obviously, everything is fictitious, even the city's names. Of Port Royal with her. Well, she thought it was her father, who was a well-to-do banker.
Mm-hmm.
One day she comes home and her, quote, father, unquote, informs her that not only is he not her father, but that she's an illegitimate child of her mother and another man from his hometown.
Mm-hmm.
And the other man finds out about her and demands custody, which, of course, the courts give him. So she finds out all of a sudden she's got to move to this little bitty town called Cedar Falls, I think it is.
Yeah.
And she has to learn to live with a new family, which her new family is her father, Eli, and her half-sister, Ruthie, and her half-brother, Jesse. So she transitions into this, but in the meantime, she finds out being illegitimate that in the 1800s, that's probably not a good thing to be because people are very judgmental and prejudiced against people who had only one parent.
Yeah.
So it's a big change for her.
Mm-hmm.
But she adjusts to it, and then I don't know how deep you want me to get into the story because I don't want to give it all away.
Sure. Whatever you think would be enticing to our listeners.
Well, her father, about a year after she moves to live with her new family, her father gets killed in a bar.
Mm-hmm.
And at 16, she finds herself trying to run a farm and raise her sister and her brother.
Yeah.
Once she gets used to doing that, because her father was killed in May, and during the summer she grows into the position of head of the household, but something happens in the fall. I don't want to get too deep into it, but
sure.
Something happens in the fall that changes her life in not a good way.
Mm-hmm.
Because she's accused of murdering someone.
Oh. Very interesting.
I don't want to go any further than that.
No, I wouldn't want you to. That is very interesting. I've not read Maggie O'Toole yet, so that will be a very exciting read.
Well, I hope you do read it.
Oh, absolutely. So tell me.
A lot of people read it.
Yeah. Oh, I hope so too. So tell me about Escape then.
Escape is the story. Escape started as an idea of in the Old Testament book of Numbers when the Israelites are getting ready to come into the Promised Land, they have to battle against the people that are already there and push them out, so to speak. And Moses told Joshua, who was the general of the Israelite army, that when he conquers a city, that the Israelites were to kill all the men, all the boys, and all of the women and girls who were old enough to have known a man. So if you take that concept,
yeah,
excuse me, and then combine that with, ironically of all things, the fascist Nazi Germany, you get an interesting concept. And that concept was that as the Nazis, well, this fictitious fascist country was called the Empire of Truth and Light. And as this country conquered the various countries, other countries on the continent where they lived, they would do just that. They would kill the men and the boys in the cities, the major cities, and they would only keep the girls that were 13 and under. And they would turn those 13-year-old and under girls into slaves. Well, you can let your imagination go crazy on that one.
Sure.
But it is a family book, so you can't go too far that way.
Right.
So the main character's name is Abigail Henderson, and she's taken as a slave when the capital city of Augustus is taken over by the Empire of Truth and Light. So as she's taken out of this, she and her mother and her little brother and, of course, other people that were in this bomb shelter, as they were all herded outside, all the younger girls are all herded over to one side. Everyone else is put up against a brick wall, and she gets to sit there and watch, well, stand there, obviously, and watch as these machine gunners on top of a tank machine down everybody else that was in the shelter with her, which includes her mother and her brother. And then to make things even worse, then they're herded into cattle cars and shipped by train to the capital of the Empire of Truth and Light, which I think is Brenton, and where she's processed as a slave. She's really mistreated, and it's intentional that she's mistreated, and it's intentional that one of the things that happens to her is that she is branded with a number. I'm sorry, she's tattooed with a number. She's branded with the letter S on top of both of her hands, S for slave.
Okay.
And she is shaved. Her entire body is shaved, so she has absolutely no hair, including eyelashes and eyebrows.
Wow.
And the reason for that is to break her spirit, and also to make sure, obviously, that they don't have any parasites or anything like that. And then they're held in this processing center for 3 days, and then eventually they're taken and sold. Well, Abigail is sold to a doctor whose granddaughter has recently suffered an illness that caused her to go blind. And what the doctor wants Abigail to become a companion, best friend, and aide to his granddaughter, whose name is Inga.
Okay.
And they do. They become good friends. They both get into this. Well, Inga gets into a private school, but since she's blind, Abigail goes with her and leads her around, and they both basically learn. They're both basically going to school, even though technically Abigail can't go to school because as a slave, it's against the law to educate them.
Sure.
Which was taken actually from the American, prior to the Civil War in the South, slaves were not allowed to be educated either. So that's kind of where that idea came from. Well, this comes to that and that comes to this. And 4 years later, she's now 16. And her owner, Dr. Van Heflin, helps the underground, and so he treats the injured underground fighters and stuff. Well, as the war progresses, the Allies, I had a name for them in the book, I just can't think of it right now. But anyway, the enemy airmen would be shot down, and the underground would bring the injured airmen to the doctor, and the doctor would fix them up. Well, one night after Abigail's 16 now. One night there's a knock on the door, and there's this underground soldiers with a injured airman from the enemy, and she kind of falls for this guy. Well, it turns out this guy has a secret, and that secret is something you have to read the book about.
Okay.
The state security find out about this person, this airman, and they come and they try to get the doctor and his family. They basically torture them, not terribly, because again it's a family book. But they make them miserable. They search the house. They come in the middle of the night, search the house. They shave Abigail and Inga's heads. They do a couple of other not too nice things. But then the doctor and his underground contacts decide it's time to get this airman and the doctor and his family out of the country. And so the rest of the story is how they escaped the Empire of the Truth and Light. And it involves horses, hiding in a truck.
Yeah.
A tank blowing up the Kugelwagen that they're in, which is the World War II German version of a Jeep.
Yeah.
And a fishing boat that gets sunk by a Imperial torpedo boat, and being rescued by a Anglosian, which is the story's version of a British warship. But it doesn't end there. It goes on. But every one of my books, even though they sound like they could be horrible, and end horribly, I should say, every one of my books have a happy ending. So anybody who reads any of my books, they just need to remember, no matter how bad it is, there's always a happy ending.
Yeah. Well, that's good. I am a Christian man, so I do believe in redemption, and I do believe in, seeing through to a hopeful ending, because I do have that sort of hope, and I want to leave my audiences better than they came in, and I do think that is something you and I might have in common, that sense of wanting to leave your audiences better than where they came in. Would you say that?
Yes. And in fact, in some of my other stories, you'll see that there's much more of a religious influence in those stories. Well, for instance, in Life and Times of Maggie O'Toole, her best friend, Catherine Roberts, is the minister's daughter.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah.
And how big of a role does that play in the story, then?
She is basically, well, for the most part, until her romantic interest gets involved, Catherine is probably the rock that Maggie leans on the most.
Interesting. Yeah, and I mean, the entire premise of Escape comes right out of the Bible.
It does, yeah.
It's very much...
Which kind of surprises some people, considering, well, for lack of a better term, the hell that Abigail has to go through in the beginning of the story. It's kind of like hard to believe that it's actually comes from something out of the Bible, because people just don't think about that part in the Bible,
I mean, Exodus is a pretty brutal story.
A lot of the Old Testament is, especially the Book of Kings and stuff.
Yeah.
I mean, you listen to it's before the Book of Kings too. But I mean, when you read some of the wars that Saul was in, and some of the things that David and Solomon and some of the other ones did, I mean, it can be pretty brutal.
Yeah. How is all of this sitting in the Bible? It was just eye-opening.
I think it just kind of shows the difference between the Old Testament and the New Testament. The Old Testament is kind of a history thing with a lot of religious taint. Is that the right word? But I mean, it's a lot of it is religion, and it looks at it from a lot of it. Is history that looks at it from a religious aspect and the influence that God had on the lives. Along with the miracles that he did, because there's quite a few of them in there.
Certainly.
But when you get into the New Testament is more about forgiveness and more about what we consider religion nowadays.
Sure.
So I mean, it's more of a pacifist when necessary.
Yeah.
But it is definitely a whole different feeling in the two books.
Definitely. And it's all one story. It's just, there's so much to mine out of it, and you see so many really solid literature today that is inspired from these stories that are so old and so powerful, that sort of transcend time.
Oh yeah, I definitely agree with that.
Yeah.
It's kind of unfortunate though when you look at some of the works that is supposed to be based on the Bible, and yet the people that are involved in that work just seems like they bend over backwards to take God out of the work completely.
Mm-hmm.
And that to me is like, I don't even know how to describe that other than it's a ridiculous premise to begin with.
Sure. So taking this back to your own writing, you had said the character of Maggie was based on your own mother, or there were elements of your mother that come through in Maggie. And so where do you find these characters? I know you said they're not really based on real people. So how do you form a character in your books?
Basically the same way I write a book. I come up with a story,
Mm-hmm.
and I basically say, okay, like for Maggie, I'm like, well, I think about like, well, let's start at the beginning. My mother was born in 1930 to an unwed mother who did her best to keep the child, but by the time my mother was 18 months old, she had to give the child up.
Mm-hmm.
So my mother was adopted, but this story is basically, based upon the idea of that, with the exception of course, my mother never knew her parents. And back then you couldn't find out your parents without going through a huge rigmarole to do it. Mm-hmm. Nowadays with Ancestry.com and such, I think it's probably a little easier.
Yes.
But so the premise was that was part of what was based on my mother, and some of Maggie's other attributes come from my mother too. But I started basically with the idea of a love child and how that love child was treated back in the day.
Mm-hmm.
And I really hate that phrase, but it comes in handy sometimes.
Yeah.
So if you go that way, then what would happen if you took a rich girl and you took her and you stuck her into a very poor family where she goes from having everything done for her to having to do everything herself?
Yeah.
And then, of course, once you get to Eli, I wanted a family for her. I didn't want just her dad, because if it was just her dad, there'd really be no reason for her to go.
Mm-hmm. So
if you bring in the younger kids, then you have something to do. And since Maggie was a teenage girl, she had to have a sister. And really, Ruthie is probably the best character in the whole book, because she was so much fun to write, because she's so exuberant, I guess is a good word.
Yeah. Exuberant.
She's a lot of fun.
Yeah.
And Maggie's kind of stayed, and she's learning about how to be an adult. Basically, it's a crash course for her.
Yeah.
And so she has to teach her daughter, or I'm sorry, not her daughter, but her sister, why she can't. For instance, her sister's caught up in the hayloft with a boy at 12 years old. And of course, she has to explain to her sister why she shouldn't be up in a hayloft with a boy alone.
Mm-hmm.
So that's kind of something that her father, Eli, of course, didn't want to get into. And since Ruthie's mom was no longer in the picture, he had to have somebody to explain it. So why not Maggie? So, Maggie has to learn how to grow. And then basically, to answer your question in a nutshell, my characters, just like my books, I start with a premise and I have an ending, and I let the story take me there.
Interesting.
I let the characters develop to fill in that story, because they do it themselves.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, a lot of
weird.
A lot of writers will say that when they have a clear beginning and an end in mind, the characters will get there for them to some extent.
Yeah, and it makes writing actually a lot of fun
Mm-hmm.
because you don't know where you're going. You know the end, but you don't know what road what street you're going to do. Are you going to turn left over here, or are you going to go straight?
Mm-hmm.
Something going to happen in between.
Yeah.
Sometimes that works out. Well, most of the time that works out, but sometimes it turns into an utter disaster, and you just have to put the book aside and maybe come back to it later, or maybe just kind of shelve the whole idea.
Well, that's actually a perfect segue. Let's talk about some utter disasters. So let's go into our final segment, all the wrongs. So where is somewhere that you felt has gone wrong in your writing process? And how did you recover from that?
Oh, let's see. There has to be. Well, I know that there's at least five books that I've started that the idea was a really good idea, and I started working on it, and all of a sudden it hit a brick wall,
Mm-hmm.
and I found there's just no way around that brick wall, and it's really frustrating not to be able to take the story where you want it to go.
Yeah.
As far as the process is concerned, there is a book that will be coming out later this year. Actually, it's two books. But it's my one and only middle grade story. It's called The Pet Shop.
Mm-hmm.
And when I was farming the pet shop out, trying to find somebody who would publish it, everybody obviously turned it down. And finally, one publisher said, look, this is the reason that we're turning it down. Because you have just, considering the age group is from 8 to 12, roughly, for a middle grade book. And since it's about fairies, it's probably the books are more for girls than they would be for boys. You
Mm-hmm.
have way too much violence in this, not enough interaction between the fairy and the main character,
Yeah.
and too much adult stuff in it. So I took that to heart because I like everybody else, I don't like criticism.
No,
But,
nobody does.
yeah, but if it's constructive and if I can put my ego aside long enough to actually look at that constructive criticism and then analyze where they're coming from, so to speak, I realized that, okay, I see the point that this woman was making. So I went back and I completely rewrote that story,
Mm-hmm.
which sounds a lot easier than it really is.
Yeah.
But then I found out that middle grade books are usually 150 pages or less.
Yeah.
And this book was like 280, 290, something like that. So I broke it into two different books.
Mm-hmm.
But that's where, you have an idea, and everybody who read The Pet Shop thought, oh, this is a wonderful book. All my friends and relatives and such that I allowed to read these books before I send them anywhere. Beta readers, I think they're called.
Yes, that is the
said,
proper
this
name.
is a great story. And, my sister-in-law said, this is great. Disney should pick this up and make a movie. And I'm thinking, yeah, that'd be cool. But then to have an outside objective person to sit there and say, hey, look, this stuff is just way too violent. And, you're talking about a trial. You're talking about how, laws are passed and all this other stuff. It just doesn't belong in this kind of a book.
Right.
So it was like kind of wake-up call.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't want to say that's the reason I haven't written another middle grade book. But let's just say that they're a lot harder to write than you would think.
Yeah. I mean,
because you can't use all of this stuff.
No, you have to... Yeah, writing books that are for kids are simple, but that does not mean that they're easy.
Yeah. Yeah, well, the stories have got to be kind of simple, but you can't put a whole lot of twists in the plot. But you still have to put enough in there to make it interesting.
Sure.
So without a whole lot of violence, just put it that way. Because people can still get hurt, just not violently.
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, that's
We're done.
The story that's coming later this year.
Yeah. Well, I think, that one we have slated for sometime end of summer, I think, is when that one will be coming out.
Let's see. That one is coming out. Pet Shop should be coming out sometime, I think, in August.
Yes, yeah.
And the
Somewhere.
sequel is scheduled for September.
Yeah. Cool.
So
Well,
we'll see how that works.
It's exciting. Well, Scott, it has been wonderful talking to you today. Really a pleasure. I'm so excited to see all of your books being rolled out over the next couple months, and I can't wait for everyone to read it. You can order your copy of The Life and Times of Maggie O'Toole and Escape at the City Limits Publishing website or anywhere books are sold. We will certainly remind you of each time one of Scott's books releases, and who knows, we might just have Scott back on the podcast to talk about some of his other books that are coming out with us later this year. Scott, thank you so much. Any final thoughts for our listeners? Where can people find you online?
You can go to Goodreads. I'm on there as I have an author blog on there. You can go to Facebook. I'm on there. You can just go to, I believe it's Scott A. Ferguson, Senior Author, or something along those lines. But you'll find me. I'm on there. Let's see. I'm on LinkedIn. And I have my own website. But if you go to my Facebook page, you can get linked to all of that stuff.
Cool. All right. Well, listeners, you can head on over to Facebook and find all of Scott's profiles. Thank you for listening today. I'm Peter Fenton, and this is Read, Right, and Wrong. What are you still doing listening to this episode? Hit pause, head over to citylimitspublishing.com and find your next book. I'm your host, Peter Fenton. You can find me online at bypeterfenton.com or follow me on Twitter and Instagram at peterfent. Have a great day, everyone.